Hi, and welcome to our Ask the Expert series. Our very first guest is Peter Thorne, who is well and truly an expert, having worked at Reclaim in the waste minimisation sector for 35 years. Over the years, Pete has worked with a range of businesses, industry, community groups, helping them to achieve some awesome outcomes with their resource recovery. Thanks for joining us, Pete.
I'm very happy to do so, Tara.
Awesome. Pete, I'd like to chat with you about product stewardship schemes. And what I mean by that is where producers, brand owners, importers, retailers, even consumers take a level of responsibility for what happens to products once we're finished with them. So it's supporting the recovery of materials that would normally just go to waste, to landfill, and reducing the harm that's caused by those products at the end of their life. Now, there are lots of product stewardship schemes, both internationally and here in New Zealand. And I understand that you have been involved with some of those product stewardship schemes. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about those and whether you think that product stewardship schemes are a good idea?
Sure, Tara. I've had a little bit of experience with product stewardship schemes, mostly from the planning point of view. But on the surface of it, when you look at product stewardship, it seems to answer a lot of the questions we have about why we're not recovering more materials and why we're ending up in potentially the situation we are. One of the biggest problems we have with current recycling is that it relies on the value of the materials and the cost that you can avoid when you actually send them to landfill. And those two things go together to actually work out whether you can whether there's enough value to recover a material. And the problem is, of course, as we've experienced in the last 4 or 5 years, when products and their values drop away substantially, when the commodity markets really drop away, the economic equation for recovering those materials really doesn't add up, and it adds a lot of extra cost onto the consumer or the consumer via the council, because of course the local councils are the ones who organise our collections. So we are ultimately paying for it as ratepayers at the end of the day. And when those commodity values fail, and in some cases the markets disappear completely, we end up with really nowhere for those products to go. The difference between that and a product stewardship scheme is that a product stewardship scheme fully funds the end life of the product. And unlike the schemes unlike recycling that we have today, where the manufacturer or brand owner hasn't got any involvement with the end of life of the product, under a product stewardship scheme, they are integrally involved in the end life of that product, and they design their product around the end of life. And of course, then the manufacturer, the brand owner, the retailer, and ultimately the consumer, who is us, we all take part in ensuring that that product gets to the end of its life, which has been planned by the brand owner. So, for example, when I buy the product, I will take it back. I've paid enough for it to be recovered. I've also paid a little bit extra so that I can get a refund back, and that refund actually incentivizes me to take that product back rather than stick it in a rubbish bin on the side of the road. The other thing, of course, is that if I did put that container in a rubbish bin on the side of the road, there's a good chance someone else might come along who that value of that refund is worth something to, so they might actually take it and recover it. For example, community groups raising funds would see these items as an absolute way that they could actually go out and raise funds by collecting some of those materials. But in essence, a product stewardship scheme covers the end of life of a product, and it makes sure that if commodity values fail, then the scheme can actually still go ahead and materials are recovered. And just while we're on that, container refund schemes, not only does the individual get a refund and the cost of recovery is in the purchase price, but the brand owners start to adjust what they're making. They use different materials. They use materials that are most economic. So then, of course, the charge on the commodity, on the product, isn't as high as if they're using a one-off material that's hard to recover. We get a much higher recovery of materials. through the product stewardship schemes, much higher than we would be recovering, and it's been demonstrated overseas that that is absolutely the case. And of course, when you take products back and they are a quality material, say for example, you look at glass. When glass goes back in a recycling scheme, it ends up being broken. And of course, if you are in the market to reuse a bottle, you're never going to use a broken bottle. But a container refund scheme will get glass bottles back whole. And I'm sure that there'd be plenty of manufacturers who, if they could get a supply of bottles back, they would definitely do that. I understand even now in New Zealand, there are companies looking at the potential of washing bottles if they can attract them back rather than have them go into recycling.
Awesome. Oh, it sounds like there's a lot of potential benefits for us all. Can you think of any drawbacks or challenges with product stewardship schemes?
Look, I think the key thing is to make sure that, you know, if you choose a category that you're going to put in a product stewardship scheme, that you've got to make sure that the requirement to operate in that scheme applies to everybody evenly. I mean, you wouldn't want an outcome where one type of plastic is let off and they're not included in the scheme, and then everybody decides to make their products out of the plastic or whatever item, commodity, or whatever material is that isn't included in the scheme. I think if it's a level playing field and it's across the board, then everyone's got the same chance. And of course, as I alluded to before, what they find overseas is that the manufacturers try to head for products that are the most economical to recover, and therefore the costs that they add to the product are kept to a minimum. So there's a self-regulating mechanism there that could end up, for example, all plastic bottles might be the same. They might all be PET. We might not have this big mixture out there, or they might all be HDPE. And so I think the benefits that come out of this are quite considerable.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, I definitely agree with your point about the potentially consolidating the types of materials, because it can be really confusing when you're looking at your recycling, for example, the different types of plastics that there are and what can be recycled where. So yeah, no, that sounds really positive. So you've mentioned just before about container return schemes. I understand that you have been involved with the container return scheme sort of planning here in New Zealand. Would you mind sort of just giving us a brief overview about what the container return scheme in particular is? And do you have any thoughts about, whether that should be introduced here? Is that a good idea? What are your thoughts on that?
Look, I think, as we've probably covered, there are many benefits to product stewardship schemes, and a container refund scheme is a particular one for beverage containers, which at the moment we don't have a high recovery beverage containers, especially beverage containers that are out on the market. And of course, with the way current recycling is working, we aren't getting the pull through that we require on the recovery of those bottles. So a container refund scheme, I was involved with just a part of a group who looked at designing a scheme for New Zealand, and that scheme I know is being considered by MFE now. I think there's a lot of people out there that are hoping that scheme will go ahead. I understand there has been a degree of or some resistance or some discussion over whether glass should be included, but as I alluded to before, I believe that the overseas experience is that the glass recovery goes well higher than it is for us at the moment through a container refund scheme. And of course, as I alluded to, there's opportunity through having whole glass bottles come back for a refilling industry to actually be part. And a lot of people my age will remember the days when you took your bottles back and got a refund on the bottles. And of course, in those days, the bottles were expensive, and so it made absolute sense for manufacturers to get them back. And wouldn't it be nice to get to a point where we could have an industry that did involve some refilling, and that we were reusing? And after all, reusing is one of the key drivers to reducing our waste.
Absolutely. Yeah. Reduce, reuse, recycle. Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for that, Pete. And just before we wrap it up, I've got one final question for you. What do you think is the most important starting point for someone that's just beginning their waste minimisation journey?
Well, I think Tara, that what I've learned over the years is that you've got to go and look in your rubbish bin. And this is one thing that when I first started many years ago, the first place I went was outside to look in. If I was talking to a company about helping them to reduce, and we worked on paper and cardboard when we started, and the first thing we did was to go and look in their bin, because the bin tells you everything, and it tells you what materials you are using, what materials you can look at and see what you can recover. You could perhaps look in the bin and say, well, could I replace any of that with something else that doesn't necessarily need to go into this waste bin? Could it go into a recycling bin? But if you're starting that journey, there's some very good resources out there now, not only online, but there is people out there that can come in and do a waste audit for you and show you quite clearly what you are recovering and what you could recover, and give you some advice on what's the best system for you. Your rubbish bin might need to look quite different. Most people find that when they do start to recycle their rubbish bin, they end up with a much smaller rubbish bin, and often find that the funding for the recovery or what they're doing comes out of them not having so much waste to dispose of in their rubbish bin. But no, I would suggest people go and have a good look, do a waste audit, and then, of course, as they get further down the track, they can look at what they are recovering, and they can check that. They can do recycling audits. They can follow up with a waste audit later on to see how successful they are, and really, give feedback to their staff and let them know how well they're doing.
That sounds awesome. Yeah, no, I think definitely it's waste. You can't really tackle your waste problem if you don't know what the problem is, what's in your waste. So yeah, no, definitely agree with that.
Yeah, exactly right.
Cool. Oh, thank you so much for joining us, Pete. Really glad to hear your thoughts on the product stewardship scheme and the container return schemes. And it's really important that we have conversations like this so that we can sort of demystify some of the work that people like you are doing to help tackle our waste problems. So thanks so much for being part of the conversation.
It's a pleasure, Tara. Thanks very much.